Humanianity, a new religious call. Humanianity, religion for us all. Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better we can be. Hi, I'm Bill Van Fleet, and this is Humanianity Conversation number 15, recorded on March 21st, 2019. It's the fourth recorded conversation with my friend Steve Rast, who has a strong grounding in academic philosophy and an interest in ethics, and therefore humanianity. We talked about the question as to whether there is such a thing as natural law inherent in us or in the universe, whether there's a place for trans-rationality, what the nature is of spiritual experiences, and how to understand the sometimes awful consequences of disagreement related to our basic hominid nature and our tendency to struggle for dominance. Okay. Then I guess we can get started then. And
okay.
So we were at a meeting last night, and one of the people there was some discussion about natural law, and I believe you have a question for me about that, right?
Well, I wanted to know if you got your question answered about natural law last night. You were asking kind of what is the definition of natural law, and then we ended the meeting and you were sort of having a conversation with that person, just you and him were having that conversation, and I didn't really hear the conversation, but I did gather you were trying to get a definition of natural law. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
no, I did not get a definition. I did do a little bit of research on that, meaning Googling, just today. But you remember my first reaction to in the meeting was to say, well, there's natural laws and natural laws, like the laws of physics, chemistry, and so forth. And that's not what was being referred to, of course. And
no.
So the other was the issue of ethics, essentially, and where ethics comes from, and whether there is an objective, in quotes, ethical philosophy or system of ethical principles that is somehow inherent in the universe, perhaps inherent in us, that means that we don't have to go any further, that we can start from there as an assumption. There is, of course, some difficulty in arriving at, well, what are those ethical principles? And, he was saying that, well, there's a list and they're prioritized and so forth. And I wasn't able to see a unified opinion about that list or its prioritization.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
It's based certainly in Christian natural law theory is based on the assumption or belief that all life is sacred, and so murder is out, and amongst really strong natural law people, abortion is out because it is life from conception, and so taking that life is a violation of moral law. Thievery sometimes comes in. Sometimes people kind of base it on the 10 Commandments, I guess, and in Christian moral theology. And but it's the belief that Well, the person you were talking to would say it's sort of beyond belief, but I think, but it's the belief that there is inherent in the world a way that we, a prescription of how we should act, and to violate that is to do essentially an evil act. The Constitution, our U.S. Constitution, is kind of based on that. All men, and it didn't say women, it didn't say slaves, but basically all men are created by their creator with certain inalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That's a natural law kind of statement.
Yes. So implied is that what makes it law is that it is the wish of a deity, I gather.
Yes, the lawgiver. Yes, we follow the lawgiver.
Yeah.
And how do we know what the lawgiver wants us to know? Well, I think that person would probably say, we know that by reading and studying what he would term Holy Scripture. Yeah.
His word, in other words.
Yeah. Yes, his word.
Yeah. The problem being that, over the many thousands of years of our experience, it's been relatively recent that book was given to us or came into existence or whatever, and that it's not the only one, and that and so it's only a part of the world and so forth. So there would be other opinions and so on. So so it would seem that there is a basic assumption being made that this particular religion is, quote, the right one, and this particular scripture is the right scripture, and things of that sort, that's a basic assumption. But there's another, I'm not sure that he would say that was the basis of natural law, as opposed to saying that the natural law is something that is built into either the universe or into us, that it is there for us to discover. And certainly the people trying to discover it could be different in their conclusions as to what they had discovered it to be. And then when I asked him, he indicated it was kind of a list of ethical principles. And when I asked him to give me the list, or at least the first one or something like that, he was declining to do that, because I think of realizing that the next question would be, why do you believe that is the first principle? And of course, then that implies that there is a way of legitimizing that by appeal to some other higher level principle. In other words, that's got to be it, because such and such is so, and if such and such and so is so, then that has to be so. And so that gets into the whole issue of if you have a system of rational ethics where each principle is legitimized by a higher level ethical principle, that you either have an infinite regress, making it impossible to ever find out, or you have an ultimate one that is arbitrary and that is not legitimized in that fashion. And so that's the position of the Humanianity project, is that okay, well, we've just got to decide on an ultimate ethical principle. And the one being put forth here that makes a person Humanian by definition, if they accept it, is the Humanian ultimate ethical principle that we should do that which will promote not only the survival of our species, but also as much joy, contentment, and appreciation as possible, and as little pain, suffering, disability, and early death as possible for everyone now and in the future. And but that is simply a principle that is being offered by one person with the belief that, yes, that's what most people indeed are looking for. That if you take a close look, that's what that would be acceptable to most people. Probably not to everyone, because there are some people who are filled so filled with anger toward humanity and so forth that they would like to see more pain, suffering, disability, and early death, or see the extinction of our species or whatever. But also along with the idea is the Humanian idea is that if we start living more and more the way we should, including our methods of child rearing, then we will have very, very few people who will say, no, I'm against existence, I'm against human existence, I'm against our species, I'm against my fellow person. There would be relatively few people that for some strange reason would have that particular orientation. So it is offered as a proposed wording in English of what most people in the world predictably, presumably, would accept if enough thought were given to it, and we kept working toward it. But there could be other such principles proposed, and we could evaluate them and so forth. But going back now to the before we branched off into the Humanianity issue here, the idea that the ultimate ethical principle, and maybe some other ethical principles or some kind of ethics, is inherent in either the universe or in at least certain creatures, us, if no other creatures, and so on, is in the first place, I think, is a proposition for which there is a felt need. And I wonder, and what goes along with that is the way that position, the position that says it is not inherent, the way they present the alternative is with the use, as you and I have talked about, of the word preference. And I got to thinking about that. My impression is that people would call it that, would use the word preference if they were against the idea, and if they really thought that there was an inherent good and evil in the universe and so on, or in us. That preference is sort of like, well, I like ice cream and I like cake and I like candy and so on, but I prefer ice cream. What it does is it makes it into a very weak kind of thing, a weak thing that in other words, oh, well, then that's just a preference, but you wouldn't mind doing this other stuff also.
Right.
So it's a portrayal of the person who has that alternative view that they're taking a position against as being somebody who would prefer that people not kill each other, but you can always kill some people too, or something. It's a way of kind of demonizing the opposition, I think. So I thought, well, okay, then there's got to be a better word. And I was trying to figure out a word, and even looked up synonyms and so on. But I came up with like longing, or I wasn't sure about commitment, or deeply desiring, or the idea of accepting and not accepting anything else. No, this is the only thing. This is what I believe, and I strongly believe in it. And I could not find any alternative word that sounded quite right in the place of preference. But I think preference is a problematic thing, because it implies something about the person who is a non, whatever you'd call it, does not have the belief that ethics is inherent in the universe or in us, and is there to be found. So I wonder about your thoughts about that. Does that sound
Well,
like?
yeah, we fall back on preference because we're not comfortable with, a lot of folks are not comfortable today with foundationalism. And if you basically, I think if you take foundationalism out of the equation, then you're pretty much left with preference. And that has sort of been where modern ethical philosophy has been, is that if you don't have a foundation, then it just becomes a preference. I don't know that Leff used that word in his article, preference, but it would seem that's kind of where he was aiming at, but we're not comfortable with that. So we keep trying to construct various and sundry kinds of foundations. Like I said last night, so many folk want to say that, well, no, there's no God, but we can be good anyway. And then there are others like Glenn Tender, who wrote the article in Atlantic and also wrote the book I mentioned last night, Can We Be Good Without God?, who says no, says we're basically living off of the remnants of the ethical system that we had when most people had more of a theistic worldview or frame of reference, and now we don't have that. And so will we eventually sort of come to the conclusion that I believe it was Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov had one of the characters say, if God is dead, then all things are possible. So you have the moral relativism.
Permissible.
Possible is what it said.
Is that what it said?
Yeah. Well, that's the translation. I don't know what the Russian, but you could say permissible too. God, then all things are okay. Essentially, there's no. Well, and that's kind of where Leff comes down in the end. List all these terrible things, and then says, those are wrong, and then he says who, and then the last sentence is God help us. And that's kind of where we find ourselves in ethics, is that we want to have some kind of foundation, and yet in some ways we appear to not want to have some kind of foundation. So Alistair McIntyre, who wrote the book After Virtue, in that book he said we don't even have the language to talk about ethics anymore. He uses the metaphor of pretend there was a time, or pretend this has happened, that you've had this maybe nuclear war or whatever, and everything's pretty much been destroyed, libraries and everything, and we're just left with fragments, and we're trying to put the fragments together, but we can't do that very well. And that's kind of where he thinks the state of ethics is today, that we really don't have a language to, like I said, like he said, a language to talk about ethics. And I think there's some truth to that, because we're having problems with definition. Well, if you can't define your terms, then you really don't have much of a language to, and then there are the folks like Wittgenstein who said something to this effect, that those who know do not speak, and those who speak do not know. And that kind of hit me when I first read that. That's and that's kind of where we find this. Now, the average person, they get on a jury or something, and they're gonna, I guess, determine guilt and innocence.
Well, it's hard to find those that know.
Yeah, it is. And those who know, how shall I put this? Those who know, I think, in a way, know that they know, but they know in a way that can't be communicated very well. And so they, for the most part, just remain silent, because we don't have a community where folks can have kind of common understandings, and that 150 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, that wasn't as true.
Well, Well, I would maintain that there's an alternative. I mean, we can't identify those who know. We're not hearing from them. One possibility is that they don't exist.
That's possible too.
Yeah.
That those who know are mistaken in their knowing, although
those who say they know.
Those who say they know. Well, Wittgenstein said those who say they know really don't know. It's the ones that don't say they know that really know.
And they can't be found because they don't say,
or can't be understood, I think, too. Some of them are found, I think, in the sense of you read literature, you read religious literature. There are folks that are writing that seem to know, but can't seem to know, but they can't communicate it very well.
So it is possible for you and I to think that a person does know, but that is
you take like who's been on a Skype conversation, so I guess I can mention his name, Mark.
Yes.
And he just, if you just met him like over coffee or something, you would just say, well, yeah, he says he retired from TIAA-CREF. He looks like kind of that, that he's maybe done that and everything, and yet he's got a experience base that is that he firmly believes that he has had those experiences. He doesn't seem to be, of course, what this means either, that he doesn't seem to be hallucinating and those kinds of things. I mean, he seems to be able to put it in somewhat of a framework, but a framework that most people just wouldn't have any connection with. And yet, when he gathers with folks who've had similar experiences, they seem to be able to communicate and that sort of thing. It's a very difficult thing. We have become we're very rational today, so everything has to be rational. What folks have taught, at least in the past, is, there's something maybe we term the trans-rational, That which after you pushed your rational faculties about as far as you can put them, you take a bit of a leap. Soren Kierkegaard called that the leap of faith or trust. But for most people, that's just a foreign language. Most people, I was telling another person last night that even in the church, people just don't have the language anymore. It's what I find. And you find very little interest in wanting to explore those things, what you would kind of broadly call Christian spirituality. Most folk aren't that interested or don't understand it or whatever. So, and I guess that's true across the board. I was talking to some of the Buddhists that I've met over in Charlotte, and they said, well, yeah, it's pretty much true in Buddhism too. You have a few that are kind of interested in the spiritual journey, and a lot of, because I kind of said, well, gosh, Buddhism, surely most people that are Buddhists are going to be interested in, spirituality and those kind of things. Well, no, it's a limited audience there too. So,
well, going back a little bit in what you were saying to this being as rational as possible and then being trans-rational or going beyond rationality, the question that I think has to be raised at that point is saying it that way, trying to present it in a different manner than saying it in, rationality does not allow me to arrive at beliefs that are really ones that I want to have because they make me feel good. So I will abandon rationality and say, well, it doesn't matter whether it's rational or not. If it makes me feel good, then I will believe it. Somebody can take that position, and therefore, and it is also possible that, like you were mentioning, Mark and his seeing of spirits and so forth, it is possible that the basic phenomenon is hallucination. And hallucination does not necessarily mean mental illness, although in some cases it seems pretty apparent that hallucinations are a part of mental illness. But it may be that we humans normally have the capability to hallucinate under certain circumstances. And the example that I gave, I think, to Mark was the possibility of hypnosis. And because a stage hypnotist can seemingly cause some of the people, a fair percentage of the people on the stage, to hallucinate and believe that things are so that are obvious to the audience as not being so. And then there is also the phenomenon of
self-hypnosis.
And I've wondered whether, to what extent, the various kinds of meditative practices and so forth, may be a kind of self-hypnosis. And I don't say that that's a bad thing. In no way am I saying that. Because I think that we need to optimize our life experience, optimize our subjective experience, and be able to enjoy this life as much as possible. The problem that comes in is that if one does give up any methods for checking on the validity of one's beliefs, then one can believe most anything. And we know from the daily news that lots of people believe things that lead to decisions that cause pain, suffering, disability, and early death. That the mother who straps a toy suicide vest on her child believes what she is doing is the right thing to do, and so forth. Well, I would want to ask her, well, why do you believe that? And why do you believe that? And why do you believe that? I would want her to give reasons for the belief. And that's what rationality basically is the determination of the reasons for believing something and whether those reasons increase the probability of the validity of the belief or not. And, so the rules of logic, that makes it internally consistent. And then the rules of evidence, scientific methodology and so forth. So I think that so there's an alternative explanation that some people indeed do see spirits and do have certain kinds of internal experience. The fact that that is so does not mean that there can only be one explanation, and that is an experience that is quote valid. Namely, that if one acts according to it, that one will not make mistakes, or will
Sure,
have...
and that's certainly true in the empirical realm too, I guess. You have the experience, and then you try to interpret the experience, and whatever way you interpret the experience, can that interpretation be an error where you would have to say so? It's but in the end, I think we're sort of left with our experience, and then, to find an interpretation that works for us, I guess. And does the interpretation always make you happy? Well, no, not necessarily, I guess. There've certainly been folks that have interpreted reality in such a way that they come away with a rather pessimistic, dystopic view of reality, I guess.
Yes, and that's our mutual Thursday night friend has and many of the people that that agree with him and so forth say that, well, yes, indeed, there's much suffering that occurs because of the beliefs that are inherent in certain belief systems like Christianity or Islam and or Judaism and so forth that emphasize that emphasize to the extent that they do the idea of punishment and punishment and sin and so forth, and that that result in us feeling bad about ourselves. And they see that as they see then Christians as being victims of that. I think that is a kind of a stereotyping of Christianity, that indeed it is correct that there are components of Christianity that emphasize, that if you don't believe what we are telling you, you will be punished, have to burn in hell for eternity and so forth, which is kind of rough punishment. But but they point out that especially telling children this can lead to a lot of suffering, and that such individuals are victims. But we know that Christianity is changing, and that the punitive component is kind of gradually falling out. It's still there in many of the, quote, fundamentalist versions of Christianity, but the progressive end of Christianity is talking about an all-loving God, and that would not do that to a person and so forth, and that. But of course, I think there is more progress to be made along that line of thought. So So there is some danger in, quote, trans-rationality, giving up having methods of determining whether your conclusions, your beliefs, are correct or not. If it doesn't make a difference, no problem. If it makes you feel good and it doesn't make a difference, doesn't cause you to cause pain, suffering, disability, and or early death for yourself or other people, then fine. But there is the question then, of, let's take a look at each of our beliefs and see what the result is of that. And it may be that, a conditional entrance to heaven may cause more hardship, more pain, suffering, disability, and early death, PSDED, than it does benefit, because it keeps people worried and distressed as to whether they're going to be left out, left behind, not favored, and so forth.
Yeah.
And then to add into that, but don't worry, you'll still continue to exist. It's just that you'll be in a burning fire pit, and suffering for the rest of eternity. That's a hard thing for a person to have to worry about. And so I think the religions are moving away from that, but they have some distance to go. So there's one other aspect of this that has occurred to me, going back to the inherent thing. In other words, whether there is inherent in us good and evil, the ability to know what is good and evil. And I think that there is a reason to believe that all of us, except a very few, do have this built into us from early childhood, from coming out into the world and being held in the arms of loving mother and nursed and comforted and caressed and so forth and made to feel good. And this mother continuing long before the child really develops language to respond in a favorable way, a loving way that produces a good feeling in the child, and then increasingly responding negatively to other kinds of behavior that the child engages in. Oh, don't do that. Hey, cut that out. Or, and then ultimately even some kind of punishment, either verbal or physical or whatever. That what that does is it means that from the beginning of our lives, we are conditioned to recognize the fact that there is a superior other that can make us feel good or make us feel bad, and that therefore we can be good, we can be bad. So the idea that knowing, well, I can be a good person and I'd better be a good person and I want to be a good person, is really built into us by that shared experience, with maybe the exception, one exception being maternal deprivation, where the child is removed from the mother and develops anaclitic depression and so on. Such a child will become impaired, maybe in many ways, but may not have built in as strongly the idea of I can be good and loved, and so on. And the feeling of being loved in communion with mother, I believe we could say, probably is a feeling that is very close to what people experience when they, quote, commune with God, that they are looking for that experience. I am approved of by God. I am loved by God. It's kind of like something maybe that we long for from the days back before we can even remember, but when we were completely taken care of and loved and so forth and made to feel so good. That experience, the kind of memory of it is something that we want to reproduce for ourselves and long to return to and try to achieve it through our methods of, quote, communing with God, or doing that which will get us into that state once again by virtue of being a good person approved of by this entity and so on. So I think there's, that range of explanations.
Yeah, and that's one interpretive framework that certainly, they're different interpretive frameworks, I guess. I come down again, it's almost like, and I think I mentioned this before on one of these conversations, but Blaise Pascal, the famous French mathematician and philosopher, and sort of shade tree theologian, I guess. He probably wouldn't want to be called a theologian, but anyway, said the heart has its reason, basically has its reasons that reason doesn't know, and that's kind of where it comes down. I think. I mean, I think I have pushed pretty hard against the various walls that are, kind of limiting. I mean, you get to a point where you don't know, but in a way you do know. It's which doesn't make a lot of sense to people who are just steeped in a very strong sense of rationalism, which is essentially our culture. The postmodernists have kind of broken through that to some degree or another, because in order to have a rational, every rational interpretation is based on some foundation that you can't justify through a rational method. I mean, like we mentioned the preference thing in ethics again. I mean, yeah, this is the way I see my experience. Now I can try to interpret that and use language and stuff to try to kind of rationally get at it, but in the end, you really have a difficult time, doing that. And there's certainly those in Christian community today that want to argue pretty strongly for a particular way of interpreting, but again, their foundation is just their foundation. I mean, there's no way to justify that so that someone who has maybe not had that particular experience, or someone who just doesn't understand that particular, worldview, will have a difficult time saying, yeah, that makes sense to me. So if it doesn't make sense, then it's sometimes called nonsense. And there's just no way to argue these things. The person you were talking to last night made the point, well, yes, I have a worldview and I can justify that worldview. Well, from the particular foundation that he's coming from, yes, I'm sure he can do that perfectly well. I've seen it done. But and I think even he would admit that foundation is more of a faith statement than it is a rational statement. And faith just means trust. In the end, we have the experience. How do we interpret that? How do we live into it? Well, each person kind of has to make their own decision on that, of what's going to be their foundational principles. Is everybody's got a foundation, else we couldn't have any conversation at all. So everybody, out there, whether it's been really thought about and meditated on or whether it's just more of almost unconscious, everybody has a worldview. And, sometimes people will test that worldview and find difficulties with it and modify their worldview, but you're still within a particular worldview. And that worldview cannot be justified by rational means, I don't believe. So that's the world we live in.
Justify it or legitimize.
Granted, it makes it very difficult, especially in these areas like ethics and morals.
Because
we want to have some kind of foundation that everybody can agree on, you might get some consensus. You might get some folks saying, "Well, yeah, that makes sense." But can you in some way, justify it rationally? Well, probably not. It's difficult to take those foundations, our worldview. It's very difficult to have a rational approach to that. Once you have the worldview, then you can use rational methods, logic, and all that to come up with some sometimes fairly decent conclusions, but it's always based on a foundation that you can't justify rationally.
So that foundation.
You went away.
I've been wondering because I've been trying to say something and I didn't think you were hearing me. Okay. Well, can you see me yet?
I can.
Oh, okay. Then let's
Where were we?
Let's restart. For anybody who happens to be watching this, we had a period of struggling for over 15 minutes, I believe, to try to get connection reestablished. At first, your sound went out, and then everything essentially froze and so forth. And so we've been working to try to get reestablished. Okay, so where were we?
Well, you were trying to respond to me, I think. And do you remember where you were responding to me?
We were talking about trans-rationality and
yes.
And the caution that trans-rationality could mean simply giving up being rational and therefore giving up having any way of determining whether one's beliefs were accurate or not. And so that then one could believe whatever one wanted to believe based upon how believing that made one feel and so forth. And that, of course, that could be good, that could be bad. And so that's the problem with that. And then I believe the last thing I was saying was that we do have an explanation for the feeling that that there is an intrinsic goodness or badness because we can feel it, and that can be from early conditioning, from out of the womb into life and into mother's arms and being loved by her, and then perhaps being disapproved of by her and even punished by her with her words or behavior and so on. And that that all of that's long before the time when we can start having memories later in life of such things happening and so on. So it can indeed seem to be coming from nowhere or to be implanted in us without explanation. But that is one possible explanation of that, and of the feeling of communing with God. It can be a replication of the feeling that one once had, or something like it, in very early in life, in mother's arms and so on. So there is that alternative explanation in addition to the explanation that indeed I'm making contact with God or whatever it might be, and so on.
Yeah, there's probably an infinite number, not infinite, but a number of different interpretive frameworks in which a person can come at the and kind of the way I've come at it is, well, I have these, I've had these experiences, and well, can I maybe find others that have had similar experiences, or may I, through various and sundry kinds of disciplines, have those experiences maybe be a little bit clearer to me than just the way they come at me ever since childhood, really. Mark said his began in 2003. I think I can go back to, gosh, far back as I can remember, and and can remember these kinds of kinds of experiences. And certainly there are folk that have written and about this over the ages, I guess, and experiences seem to be somewhat similar. And also, there's kind of an agreement, certainly amongst folks in the theological field and to some degree in the philosophical field, that there you can, and you should take the rational as far as you can take it, but you run up against a wall, and do you just say, well, we don't know, so I won't think about it anymore, or do you continue kind of pushing it? And I think when you push it, you get into that realm of, well, what some people have termed the trans-rational, folks like Pascal and trying to think of others, the mystics, in all the religions. Because in all the religions, the mystics are a very narrow niche in the whole religious field. I mean, when you look at any of the world religions, the majority of the people in the religion are not or don't seem to have those kinds of mystical experiences and that sort of thing. But when you have them, I think, at least that's been my experience, and also Mark's, you want to somehow try to figure out why you're having these experiences, I guess. And when you run up against that wall of where you just can't push it anymore, rationally, I guess, you just kind of you're beyond, you're just beyond the rational, and yet you still have the experience. And so you're always, I think, at least I have been trying to put it into an interpretive framework, and evidently that's what drove Mark in around 2003, 2004 to begin doing a lot of investigating, I guess, to kind of see why he was, having these experiences that he was having. And he certainly met a lot of interesting people.
Yes.
From what he's told me. Well, yeah.
I wonder what percentage of the population has experiences that they would perhaps say fell under the heading of, quote, mystical or spiritual.
I think it's pretty narrow. These folks that have kind of been labeled the trans psychologist, I guess, or trans psychology, pretty much from their standpoint, it's a small amount, although they believe that, and there's some evidence for this, that you can induce these experiences through such things as LSD and that sort of thing in a controlled environment, as folks like Dr. Stanislav Grof did, and he was a psychiatrist. And also this institute up in Virginia that Mark has been to. It starts with an M, and the Monroe Institute. They use sound to take you to different levels of consciousness, alpha, beta. I forget what the others are, and that work actually grows out of some things that were going on in the CIA in the 50s and the 60s when they were studying this whole thing of I guess they would call it, what would they call it? Well, sort of the stuff that Dr. Ryan was doing up at Duke, I guess. But they also experimented with sound to bring about these, I guess, what they termed altered states of consciousness, I guess. And so they can be apparently induced. I've never tried to induce any of them, I don't think. I think they've just come on me at particular times, and not a great amount. I mean, probably 4 or 5, which probably only one of those was real significant, I guess. Yeah. And I'd been at a monastery for a week, so you had been doing a lot of quiet prayer, contemplative prayer, silence, and that sort of thing. When I had the experience, I'd just come away from the library reading some stuff in quantum physics. And so, so does all that have something to do with, I don't know. But I haven't tried to intentionally induce these experiences like people do who maybe take LSD or go to the Monroe Institute or whatever. Because I guess when you do that, you're saying, yeah, I'm going to find some kind of way other than the path of spiritual discipline to make these experiences happen.
And a neurologist has told me that but I don't have the reference, that they have determined that the out-of-body experience it can be produced by, I guess, stimulation in the area of the temporoparietal region of the brain and so forth. And of course, from the natural scientific standpoint, we kind of make the assumption that this thing called consciousness, which is problematic, of course, is very highly dependent upon the functioning of the brain, and that any kind of conscious experience that we have, there would be a corresponding activity of some sort going on in the brain. But of course, that would remain to be seen. I mean, one could always say that, well, most of the experiences were not of that sort, but if you set up a laboratory kind of thing, then you can, yes, reproduce it or something, in other words, so there can't be.
Because we assume that the chemicals like LSD or whatever are somehow affecting a physical brain. Of course, that too is a foundational statement to even say that that brains exist, because you're still dealing with your experience of a brain existing,
and that gets into the mind-body problem. And,
it does. Yeah.
And you've actually read my book 3 on the mind-body problem.
Yes.
So you kind of know the terminology, but that would be difficult to get across to any viewers.
I highly recommend it. I'm going through it for the second time now.
Oh, are you?
Yeah.
Well, listen, if you find any sentence that seems unclear or incorrect, if you can let me know, that would be great.
I will. Yeah. The only thing I've found so far, and this is a common error in grammar, is that you have, and I've marked it, I can't remember right where it is now, but I've marked it, is that you're using gerunds and you're not using the possessive as a subject of that gerund. So, for instance, you don't say he smoking, you say his. You don't say he smoking bothers me, you say his smoking bothers me. So, smoking is used as a noun there, as a gerund. A gerund
Uh-huh.
is a verb used as a noun, an ing verb, and the subject of those gerunds are always the possessive case. But that's a pretty narrow technique.
Yeah.
But
Well,
that's
tell
all
me
right.
again, I'm not real clear. Uh, I can see, for instance, he smoking bothers me. I can also see his smoking bothers me. And is one of those incorrect?
Yes, the he is incorrect because you're dealing with a gerund, and the subject of a gerund, which is the masculine pronoun singular, is always possessive. So
I see. And
it's possessive case.
so I said something the equivalent to he smoking bothered me.
Yes, you were treating that
Okay.
verb as a participle, yeah.
I
And,
see.
and that's a common error. I see it all the time. Folks that do this English stuff and teach English, they always say certain things are their pet peeves. I guess not using possessives with gerunds are
Yeah.
one of my pet peeves.
Yeah,
I
well,
guess
that's great. If you'd
I
send me the
tend to spot them. So yeah,
yes,
I've got it spotted. I'll go back and I've got
great,
it in my notes
great.
somewhere,
Uh-huh.
but I'll get that to you. But that's a minor thing. Most
Yeah,
people would
well, yeah,
use
right.
those.
Yeah, and what I was basically referring to, of course, was where the meaning was unclear. Uh,
I know. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
No, I hadn't found that to
Uh-huh.
be. I think again, like most people do. I mean, you have in a way kind of an epiphenomenal view of consciousness. In other words, consciousness is sort of a byproduct of various and sundry brain chemistry and that sort of thing. Yeah, because
That I
a very
don't.
common
Yeah.
view.
No, I think that that would be a little bit different than my approach. What I finally arrived at in the book is different than anything I have ever heard or read, and
Hmm.
it it um, it has resulted in me saying to people, I don't think normally anymore. um,
Uh huh.
so
Well, I'm certainly there too. So yeah,
yeah, well,
yeah.
that's great. I'm glad to hear that. And so well, let's see. So one of the of course, from my standpoint, a main reason for having humanity conversations is to get the idea of humanity out there
Hmm.
and to get feedback, corrective feedback that, if there's anything that seems not right in it and so forth, um, to know about that, because of course maybe the whole idea is um, um, not optimal in some way, not rational or not feasible or whatever. But so far, it seems to me that that in my mind that it's one of the most important things that we humans
Hmm.
can become aware of and become committed to, and that it is a valid set of ideas. But of course, that means very little when it's said by me, who has put forth these ideas and everything, because we well know that a person can be, quote, way out in their thinking. But so I am, continuously welcoming and looking for any kind of critical feedback.
Right.
Uh, the and why I think it is kind of almost the most important thing for us to uh, to start thinking of as a species, is because I look at all the pain, suffering, disability, and early death that we humans cause each other. Most of our PSDED is caused by, or at least contributed significantly to, by what we decide to do. And in addition to that, we've become so powerful with our technology
Mm-hmm.
that we can not just make little unfortunate episodes of causing each other and ourselves PSDED, but huge, like we have the capability of exterminating our species with our nuclear arsenal and so forth.
Sure.
It's probably not likely that we're going to have nuclear rain, but that's just one example. And then there's all this concern about what we're doing to our environment and all the other species, or most of the other species on the planet, and so on. So, and here we are on this little planet, and I don't think it's that for all of us to migrate to Mars is going to be possible.
No.
Or to just embark into spaceships and live forever that way in search of another galaxy where we can find an appropriate planet. I think we have to really think about right now, what are we in danger of doing? And can we develop an ethics, a set of beliefs about what we should and should not do that is more effective than what we have been having so far? More effective in that there's more clarity to it, such that people are clear about what they believe and so forth. More agreement and more commitment to that, then there's the practical application of that. There's so much work to be done, and it is being done. I mean, you listen to NPR, and the people in all areas of life are trying to work on making things better for everybody. But if we can't work as a unified species, if we can't come together much, much more than we have ever done so far, then we're at high risk, and we also paralyze ourselves as far as the cooperative effort to bring something about that requires a large portion of the population to agree and to cooperate with the effort. So anyway, that's putting in a plug for Humanianity, but that's
Sure.
that's
Well, and yeah, too, you come up against that problem too of someone having a view of a particular ethical situation that they're willing to kind of almost give up their own life for that idea. You look at Martin Luther King, you look at Oscar Romero. I mean, seeming to have a knowledge that if I push this far enough, people are not going to like these. Some people are not going to like these ideas so much that they're going to try to destroy me. Now, I've had people that wanted to kind of destroy me from a reputational standpoint, but never. Well, we did, as I think I said, maybe said in one of the Tuesday night groups. When I was running for mayor in '94, we did get a death threat at the house, but
really
yeah.
My
But
goodness.
yeah. So how do you? I mean, that one is always kind of entranced me as well, not entranced me, but it makes you think. Are there, what was it? Maybe it was Martin Luther King who said, Jr. who said this. You know, if you don't have something to die for, you don't have something to live for. And often sometimes those in power will use that threat of physical injury or death to get you to do what they want you to do, or stop doing what they don't want you to do. And that's always, from an ethical standpoint, that has always, you know, come up in my mind. Are there some deaths that are good deaths? Is there some, because some suffering that's almost like redemptive suffering? We mentioned that at the Wednesday night group, not last night so much, but the month before, we talked a little bit about that. It was two months ago when we were dealing with that whole issue of suffering. Yeah, so that too has to kind of come up in ethic, and then that becomes almost kind of that trans-rational we were talking about, because the rational thing to do would be to preserve your life, and yet is that the highest calling we have? Well, that's something each individual person kind of has to work out for themselves, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's right. In the Charlotte Humanianity group, we had a visitor who was posing like different kinds of death, or asking asking me pretend like to kill him in the most painful way, and would I do that, and so forth, and when that was his request, and so on. Well, all of that has to do with that. It is not often true that the reasons for doing a particular thing are all on one side of doing it. In other words,
Right.
that there are no pros and cons, and so we are actually always making judgments, kind of the best we can. But if we say therefore, it really doesn't make any difference. So let what happens happen. I think that is a very unfortunate decision to make, because it increases pain, suffering, disability, and early death. I think that certainly it is true that we often have unintended consequences occur that we did not predict. But at least we can make the effort to predict what the sum total consequences are of what we're planning to do. And that would include the situation of, well, do I do this and die and save, X number of people, or do I let X number of people just go ahead and die and me stay alive? Well, you could imagine, well, it depends maybe on who those people are and where one is in one's life and what one has to contribute, and so forth. And so you could always build up a situation where it's better that more people die and this person be preserved because something about this person. You could always construct a situation like that. So any particular situation is going to be going to have specific aspects to it that then make for a very complex ethical judgment. But if one has thought through one's ethical principles and rules of conduct and so forth, then and one feels committed to them, the odds are greater that the set of outcomes will be those that are intended and desirable. So
Yeah, I think so. I think when we're looking at those kinds of more complex situations, we are well, it does become a little messy, yeah.
yeah,
And you, like you said, you do the best you can. Realizing they're probably, no matter how well you try to think it out, there are going to be unintended
yeah.
consequences, whatever you do. And
But an important ethical principle is to always be open to feedback.
yeah,
If somebody is saying, "Hey, what you're doing doesn't make sense, or it's not right, or something,"
sure.
to say, "Okay, I want to hear more about that." I want to try to get as clearly in mind as possible what the reasoning is, the principles are, and so forth, and to recognize that one's brain is programmed, and it's very difficult to change. A part of that, like that's where cognitive dissonance comes in. In other
Mhm.
words, to change one belief um, will have an impact with regard to a whole bunch of other beliefs, and some of those beliefs can be, quote, very important to the individual. And so being able uh, to look at one's beliefs and to question them and to keep getting feedback, as long as there is difference of opinion, I think is very important. I think that's a high level ethical principle that,
Yeah, yeah. Um, but it's difficult. Like I said,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
complex, and one has to be a bit humble, I think, in the way they approach these things. Um, Sometimes in discussions, there's more um, heat and fire than light, I think, sometimes.
yes,
A lot of times, I think, at least for me, it's more important in that situation to those situations to listen and
mm-hmm.
try to see where, folks are coming from, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to just kind of jumping in and, you know, saying, excuse the vernacular, this is just BS.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
we've
and,
seen that.
and 30 or 40 years ago, I was probably more that way.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, mm-hmm.
um, bit idealistic in some respects, still a bit idealistic according to some people, but even more so then. And you're impatient. Um, I've found the older you get, the less impatient you get. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's just me, but these things most likely eventually work themselves out. Is there some pain, suffering, and early death working it out? Well, yeah, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
that happens, and it is apparently just the way reality is structured. There's a certain amount of what we call evil, what we call good, what we call suffering. Life just seems to bring
Yeah,
us, and yeah,
yeah. Well, that's true, but I think we can say a little bit more about it. That is um, very important and meaningful, and that is that this phenomenon that you and I were just talking about, um, which we can describe as in the process of sharing and comparing ideas, when there's difference of opinion, anger appears and hostile behavior.
mm-hmm.
That happens. That it is so important for us to recognize what that is, and and it has, I think, to do with our built into us as a dominance hierarchy species, is this whole issue of where one is in the dominance hierarchy. And so when we consider in some way that our beliefs place us somewhere, like, oh, this person's beliefs are wonderful. This is a good person. This is somebody high up that we should look up to. Or, that person believes a bunch of bullshit. We look down upon, well, the looking up to, looking down upon is a dominance hierarchy phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so it is very easy for us hominids to engage in these struggles for dominance in highly unusual human ways, like in our verbal and nonverbal communicative behavior and so forth. And so if we understand who we are and what we're dealing with, and understand that that is built into us, but it can be inhibited and it can be modified, and it's important to do that in areas of importance where not doing it leads to pain, suffering, disability, and early death, then is important. You look kind of sleepy, and probably
it's been a long day.
Yeah, we've talked a long time, so
we have. Yeah.
So it's probably time to wrap up.
Yeah, it's almost 4:00. Yeah. Get ready to go to Charlotte tonight. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So you'll be there. Yeah, good. Okay.
Got to get a story together. I've been thinking that.
Yeah, I don't have one, so I'll just be there to listen.
Yeah, I guess you can pass if you.
Yeah, hopefully so.
Be okay with that, but I got a lot of stories, I guess. But which one? I think life is essentially a story itself.
Yeah. That's right.
I've used that metaphor before. We have a story, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll have a minor end here to our conversation,
and
but
I guess I'm sort of back alert again now. I guess. But
yeah. Well, it's not an unusual phenomenon. If I talk at some length, then I have learned that there seems to be a hypnotic effect on other people. so I have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I've done that before on the phone with people. They were just talking, and somehow I just kind of drift. I don't know if I go to sleep or not, but sort of just zone out a little bit or something. But I was feeling that when you mentioned that, I said, I'm feeling a little, I don't think I've got time to take a nap between now and going to Charlotte, though. But I'm sure that'll be lively enough to awaken me.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's usually a good bit of fire and heat there from time to time.
Yeah. Okay.
And some light.
Light, yes. Okay.
There's some light amongst all the other stuff.
Right. Okay, well, we will temporarily flip off the switch.
Yeah. We did. I think the natural law thing, we dealt with that pretty well. I think people hearing that will understand what that's all about.
Hopefully so. Maybe in the comments they will, add some things or, provide some questions and so forth.
Yeah.
So hopefully. Okay, well, I'm going to hang up then. And so it's been great.
We'll see you tonight, I guess.
Yes. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Humanity, now we all can see. Humanity, how much better